This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
It's kind of like a backwards striptease. I didn't write this book for believers. God is circumcised, clearly. I like the idea of a theological pigeon.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Francesca Stavrakopoulou is Professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Religion at the University of Exeter. I normally wouldn't stress her job title, but I have an idea that we might be saying a couple of contentious things, so there is some point to giving the bona fides. Francesca, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, the book is called God and Anatomy, and just to be clear, it's precisely that, isn't it? A tour of Yahweh's body from head to toe, quite literally.
Yeah, or from toe to head.
Yes, because you start with his feet.
It's kind of like a backwards striptease.
Yes.
It's telling the cultural origins and earliest history of the deity that we mostly know as God in the Western world, who began life in the southern Levant about 3,500 years ago. And it sort of tells the story of this deity and his characterization and portrayal and the ways in which his ancient worshippers understood him, and how those things are reflected and refracted, I suppose, in the Bible.
Well, now modern day worshippers are going to say, "Oh, yeah, but that's all allegorical." When you talk about God's feet or God turning His face away, or all the other, and we'll come to some quite racy ones in due course. They're going to say that's all allegorical, but they're retconning, aren't they? They're misreading the Bible that we have.
Yeah, I mean, the biblical texts are very elastic in the sense that they, the reason that they've survived, the reason that they've been transmitted over many generations and edited and reshaped and re-edited, is that they're so ripe for, like any kind of literature, so ripe for reinterpretation. So as people's views of the divine shifted and changed, so most Christian and Jewish readers today would look at these texts and say, oh, this is metaphorical language, this is poetic. Yes, it's beautiful and isn't it lovely, but these things are not meant to be taken literally. But what I argue in the book is that, well, actually, originally, ancient worshippers understood this deity to have a human-shaped body. It was very different from their own bodies, from human bodies in lots and lots of ways, but it was human-shaped. And that a lot of the imagery that we read about in biblical texts derives from this very common, widespread cultural tendency across ancient Southwest Asia to understand the gods as having human-shaped and human-like bodies, but on a much bigger, more glamorous, exciting, terrifying scale.
I have to say that with your book, I was kind of like a 6-year-old at Legoland. I don't know where to go first, except that I sort of do. I want to say I tend to divide books on religion into polemical and scholarly books. And well, you're a professor at a university, so it is thoroughly scholarly. Was there any part of your intention to put the cat among the pigeons as well?
Not so much putting the cat among the pigeons theologically. I didn't write this book for believers. I wrote this book for people who aren't Christian or Jewish and who might not know the Bible particularly well, or they might think, it sounds really boring, I'm not really interested in it.
Or they might have read it as children and taken those things on board, but had it explained to them that God didn't actually walk in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas that's clearly the intention of the narrative.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to show that, I wanted people to understand these texts as they emerged in the ancient social and cultural contexts in which they were written and passed down and reshaped. This book wasn't written for believers. Some believers who have read it have really enjoyed it and really like the fact that
and some are going to really dislike it.
And some people are going to hate it. But, it wasn't about setting the cat among the theological pigeons. I like the idea of a theological pigeon. It was more about saying, look, the Bible's really, really interesting, and ancient religion is really, really cool and fun and interesting. And I wanted to show people why that is.
With that in mind, of course, the book is mostly about Yahweh, the God of the Bible. But you very, very deliberately and carefully place him in context when there was a time when he wasn't the only God. And modern believers like to imagine that, or it's that Ricky Gervais thing, isn't it? About, all those gods are made up and they're just silly stories, except yours.
Yeah.
Your God is real. Now, way back when, and we're going back, we probably need to do some dates here, but we're going back a couple of thousand years before the current era, as we like to say.
Well, more than that, yeah. About 3,000 years.
Well, yeah, but I was going to come on to this later, but then when did God become, when did the Jews develop their monotheism? When did God ditch his family and his all the other accoutrements and stop, having contests with the other gods?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult question to unpack in the sense that we can't really talk about Jewish people until about, at the very earliest, conservative scholars, at the very earliest would say about the 5th century BCE, so before the Common Era. That's when you can really start to talk about...
We can't talk about...
No, because the word didn't mean... that there is no, in that sense, there's no word for Jewish in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. You could talk about Hebrew, the word Hebrew appears, the term Judah and Judahite appears. But, these are different sorts of labels. They're not the kind of, those labels, the label Jewish is not, and Jew is not used in the Bible in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible in the ways that we would understand.
And yet, from my understanding, the pivotal event is the Babylonian exile.
Yeah, which was 6th century BCE.
Yeah, the very beginning of the 6th
so that's when the
BCE.
people of Judah, which is a small polity, roughly mapping onto the area that we would now identify as, Jerusalem and the West Bank, those sorts of areas. That's when Judah was defeated and destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the elites from Judah were taken off into exile into Mesopotamia, some went down into Egypt. And that's when you get this theological shift. It was the elites who were primarily producing the literature that we find in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible today. And that's when they undergo this kind of profound shift. So you can start to talk about the beginnings of what would later become Judaism at about this time.
And of course, up to that, as I learned from your books, God lived in the Temple of Solomon. That was where he lived.
According to the people in Jerusalem, whereas up the road in Samaria, Yahweh lived in a temple in Samaria, and he lived in a temple in,
Oh, and you tell us the temple at Bethel was at least as magnificent as the one in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think it was just as important.
But it's that exile, isn't it, that causes the rethinking that if they can't confront their God personally in the temple, they need to develop a theology that brings him with them, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, the gods had always been understood to be relatively mobile. But I think because it was primarily the elites from Jerusalem who started to kind of inscribe this sort of shift theologically in the texts as we now find them, they're so bound up with Jerusalem and its monumentality, this very urban kind of religion that was closely tied to things like statehood, kingship, high status priesthoods, that, when you're away from that physical place, you have to kind of think, well, does this mean that, has our God been defeated? Has our God abandoned us and deliberately sent us off into exile? Is he punishing us for some reason? Does that mean that we are so cut off from this deity now that we're in Babylonia? And, for some of these, you get reflections in biblical texts of some groups saying, we are cut off. Yes, he has abandoned us, or yes, he has been defeated. He's a weak deity. But a lot of the theological and ideological parameters of the text that we now have in the Hebrew Bible saying, no, he's not, just because you're not in Jerusalem doesn't mean to say that you can't have a relationship with this deity. This is a deity who is not confined or constrained by his own particular territories. This is a deity who can reach into foreign enemy territories.
Whereas before this, where his feet were, you said you start the book with his feet.
Yeah.
I never really understood the significance of sacred ground before.
Yeah.
But it's that, isn't it? It always seemed to me like a kind of sentimentality in various peoples. But it's that's where God's feet are, if in the temple.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the Ark of the Covenant is God's footstool and these things.
Yeah, that's reflected in various traditions that we find, when God says, let us, notice the plural language, let us.
Again, because there were others.
Yeah,
he wasn't alone.
The Bible's very happy about him he's not this solitary deity like mooching about the heavens on his own. he's accompanied by other divine beings and cosmic powers and sort of divine messengers. And historically, he was accompanied by other deities. Most scholars now would agree that he had a consort, a wife, the goddess
This is one of the
Ashera.
things that's going to drive people nuts. I mentioned that I was going to be talking to you on social media, and somebody who'd been a Christian, who'd been very measured up to that point, went ballistic. She's not going to talk about what's she called? Asherah. She's not going to talk about Asherah as God's wife, is she? And I said, yeah, I think she probably will.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll ask her to. Would you mind?
Yeah, well, most scholars now agree that. I mean, we've got lots of references in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, to Israelite and Judahite worshippers, being condemned for worshipping Asherah, who's a deity, and the god Baal, and the host of heaven, which is this kind of catch-all label for all the other kind of divine beings, and within this very polytheistic framework in which Yahweh worship emerged. And yet, in the 60s and 70s, there were some sensational inscriptions unearthed which refer to Yahweh and his Asherah. Now, most biblical scholars today would agree that this is a reference to the deity Asherah. And we know, she was a version of, that's the localized Hebrew name of a goddess who was known all across the southern Levant by different sorts of names. Atherat is her name up in Syria, for example.
Where she was the wife of El.
Where she was the wife of El.
You're very clear on this, that culturally, Yahweh is a descendant of El and other gods, which is really interesting. Not he's not supposed to be, he's not blood relation, but he is an expression of, or what is the relationship?
A version of, I would say. So I think what I try to set out in the first chapter of the book is just to point out that we've got lots of sort of fragments of what look to be very old mythological motifs and poems in all sorts of biblical texts, including Deuteronomy, Book of Exodus, Genesis. And there's one particular fragment in Deuteronomy in which it talks about the high god, who's known as Elyon, which just means like the big high, the most high, the most high deity, dividing up the nations according to the number of the sons of God. And sons of God was a very common Levantine label for the lower tier deities who were, the children, the offspring, if you like, of the high god El and his consorts. And Yahweh appears as just one of these. He's given the people Israel, or Jacob, as they're called in this particular text. They are apportioned to him. That's his particular share. And again, most scholars, I know a lot of people, particularly believers, think that this is all, sensationalizing and sort of misinterpreting. But most Hebrew Bible scholars, most scholars in my field would agree with me when we say, well, yeah, Asherah was worshipped as a consort of Yahweh. She was an indigenous, normative feature of ancient Israelite religion for a long time.
So when did Yahweh ditch the missus?
Well, it looks like here's when things get a little more complicated. I mean, these inscriptions I'm referring to date from the 8th century BCE. Depending on when you date certain polemical texts in the Hebrew Bible, some scholars date them as early as the 7th century BCE. I'm not 100% convinced on that. But around the 6th century, when the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile to Babylon happens, and then certainly by the 5th century, you've got this huge polemic against what was basically traditional, normative, ancient Israelite and ancient Judahite polytheism. But there's a real shift away from it in the light of this, really culturally and religiously traumatic event. Because it wasn't just, Jerusalem's temple that was destroyed. Other places in Judah had already been under attack. This was a place that was constantly being invaded. It was caught between Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia.
That's right. It's a really unimportant place in a really strategic area.
Absolutely, in terms of trade and economics. I mean, it was huge. So that's why everybody's like trampling through it. I mean, and that's obviously something that's continued right up into the modern day. And so, that seemed to have marked a really big shift in practice. And it's not just theological, there are economic ideas about this. It's about a fracturing of a way in which a society functions. Once monarchy collapses, once all of, the sort of some of the temple priesthoods are taken off into exile, it's like things change dramatically, and things, we've seen it in various aspects of English history as well and European history. Look at how quickly religion can turn and change because of various political, economic, social factors. So a similar kind of thing happened back in the 6th century BCE.
Back to Legoland. So I do want to turn to his body. We need to talk about that. You're brilliant on all the feet and the footprints in the the Middle East or the Levant and around there. Let's talk about God's physical body then a bit in this time before he was sort of what do you call it,
disembodied.
Disembodied is good.
Yeah.
Before he was disembodied. You probably know where I'm going to go next. We have to talk about God's penis. You have an account of a fascinating rabbinic discussion about whether God was circumcised.
Yeah.
How do they get there? How do they get into that discussion?
It's not that they get into it. I mean, I think in really important period of rabbinic study. So we're talking about, it's from from the 1st century CE up to about the 5th to the 6th century CE. What a lot of rabbis were doing were they were seeking to understand not just their holy scriptures, but seeking to discern more mysteries about God by studying those texts and scriptures. And and it wasn't a monolithic movement at all. I mean, rabbinic scholarship was hugely varied and diverse, like any kind of scholarship is. And some aspects were far more mystical, some aspects were far more sort of dry. But basically, it was a completely normal thing. They absolutely understood that man had been made in the image of God, and they really worried about circumcision.
Well, of course they did, because man made in the image. Well, man made in the image of God. Man is made uncircumcised, and then it's the covenant.
In other words, so because the covenant with Abraham. So obviously Abraham is not the first man to be made, according to the biblical story of the past. The first man is Adam. And God loves Adam. God creates Adam because he wants him to exist and he wants Adam's descendants to persist. And one of the most important aspects about this is that the sign of the covenant that Abraham and that sort of experiences or undergoes with Yahweh, when Yahweh tells him, this is what you need to do. You need to circumcise yourself and your household, and all your male descendants after you need to be circumcised. It was really perplexing for some rabbinic scholars to think, well, if circumcision is a really important part of what it is to be in a good relationship with God, yes, it's a part of a promise that God makes that he will kind of give this particular territory to Abraham, his descendants, and he will bless Abraham with fertility. And it's a mark of Abraham's, it renders him blameless or righteous. It kind of modifies his body
so that he can
much.
walk with God, because you need to be perfect to walk with God.
And I mean, that's putting it very simply. So then they worried. They said, but hang on, Noah is called blameless and righteous. And Noah is said to walk with God. And yet nowhere in our text do we find that he was circumcised. Well, how come? Was he circumcised? We're not told that he was circumcised. So have we missed a bit in the story where God told Noah to circumcise himself? Well, if so, that kind of devalues what, the covenant with Abraham in which he's circumcised. And then they started to worry, well, does that mean that Adam was created with or without a foreskin? And so, they said, well, obviously, Adam and Noah didn't need to be circumcised because they were already foreskin free. That basically Adam had been created without a foreskin because, the rabbi said, he was made in the image of God. And therefore, God is circumcised. Clearly, they just assumed that God himself was circumcised because this is about perfecting the male body and kind of constructing a certain kind of masculinity. So, of course, the paradigm of that is God himself. So, of course, he's circumcised. So if he made Adam in his own image, Adam was made without a foreskin.
We end up, or at least the image makers of the Christian era end up with an old man with a big white beard.
Yeah.
But that's not the God of the Bible. In the West, that's true. Yes.
Yeah.
But it's not the God of the Bible, is it? He's muscular. He's trampling enemies underfoot, and he's got a ruddy face and vigorous dark hair.
Yeah, mostly. So it's only when you get into the we get this notion early Christianity, sort of in the West, in some parts of Eastern Christianity as well, but particularly early on in Western Christianity, they inherited this idea that was mainly drawn from both the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the New Testament, and the book of Daniel, which is the latest book, if you like, in the Old Testament.
And which, let's date it, because it's
the
important.
book of Daniel, 2nd century BCE.
As recently as that.
Yeah.
Maybe 150 years before Jesus.
Oh, no. Well,
Less than that.
Yeah. Oh, well, who knows when Jesus was. But yeah, basically, I mean, we're talking about Revelation. Revelation's probably early 2nd century, very end of the 1st century CE, early 2nd century. So yeah, you've got this image of a high God enthroned in the heavenly realm. And, he's got these sparkling, dazzling white robes on, white hair, white beard. And that kind of whiteness, this brightness, is basically, it's drawing on all sorts of much older cultural motifs. It's nothing to do with the degenerative state. This is not an aged God whose hair's sort of turned grey because he's so old. It's bound up with ideas of sparkling cleanness or cleanliness, holiness, and sort of a ritually perfect kind of a sacred kind of quality, a holiness. But anyway, this in the book of Daniel, it's in chapter 7. You've got this image of this white hair, dazzling white and sort of fiery kind of deity sitting on a throne, conferring kingship on a much sort of younger divine being. And this is drawn on this is a very old mythic trope that's been recycled. I mean, we find it all the way back in Ugaritic culture, which is sort of late Bronze Age.
And where the god El that we were talking about.
Where it's El who's conferring kingship on, usually in the Ugaritic myths, it's Baal, but we do get hints that there are other divine
and then this ancient story is recycled by the Christians.
Well, Christians love it because for them it makes complete sense. So, they think, well, this younger junior deity, if you like, who's being given this kind of heavenly kingship is obviously their dude, Jesus. I mean, but at the same time, and even before that, slightly before that, you had ideas that within more conventionally Jewish tradition, I say conventionally Jewish because obviously Christianity was, earliest, the Jesus movement was a Jewish movement. It's very hard. You can't sort of distinguish between the two. So yeah, but you got, the same similar sorts of claims were being made of Enoch, of this being this second power in the heavens, this heavenly being who, was human, but then was kind of upgraded, if you like.
Was it Enoch that he had transcribing his library?
Yeah.
But very, very human activities. I mean, your whole book is littered with events like that make, God not being able to hear, having to go looking for Adam in the Garden of Eden, and all these things that are not omnipotent and omniscient and not detached from.
Yeah, because all of those ideas. I mean, you I'm not trying to draw a really sharp distinction between what was then and then what then Christianity did, but essentially, all of those ideas about omnipotence and omniscience, they're so freighted. They're very Christianized notions about what a deity is, and notions that derive in part from a lot of Greek philosophical ideas about the nature of reality, the nature of the cosmos, the differences. What it is, what is the divine compared to what is the material and the human and the changeable. And so all of those qualities are philosophically laden, and they're adopted and adapted by, these very philosophically inclined early Christian theologians who decide that, actually this is the way that God really is. And the only way that he was embodied was in the person of Jesus. And, it's that they're trying to make sense of their own inherent polytheism, to be honest. They're trying to say, how could God have become flesh? Is it the same God, or is this a junior God? Or, they're still trying to work out their own stuff, which is why they're so reliant on philosophy to try to understand and to make sense of what's essentially, trying to explain away a kind of a miniature form of kind of Christian pluralism.
Well, in a way, what Christianity is that Judaism with a big wodge of Greek thinking loaded onto it.
But the thing is, a lot of these ideas are pre-Christian. So you find it, they're drawing on. So I think that would be false to say that, it's Judaism plus Greek philosophy equals early Christianity. That's not the case at all, because in the 2nd century, even in the 3rd century BCE, when it looks like some of the Hebrew scriptures were being translated into Greek or rendered into Greek, translation makes it sound like it was a straight word for word, and it's not quite that simple. But even then, you start to get a shift within certain Jewish scribal communities and intellectual communities away from a more anthropomorphic view of God, certainly, and away and stuff that looks to us from this vast distance and this vast time as, oh, that's Greek philosophy. This was just normal philosophy. This was normal philosophical thinking at the time.
Yes, some of the Jewish thinkers had a big Greek. I mean, you mentioned Philo of Alexandria, who was very Greek.
I mean, he's Greek and but also, he just happens to be Jewish. So, I mean, I think that's the thing. We're talking about certain sort of intellectual spheres in which, I wouldn't want to draw a sharp distinction between, this is Greek and this is Jewish and this is Jewish and this is Christian. It's, we use those labels really problematically, I think, to kind of try to tell a story about changes, theological changes and philosophical changes. But this was all, a lot of this stuff came out of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, the 2nd century BC, the 1st. I mean, this was a hugely cosmopolitan, brilliant, wonderful city and society. And it was just something that was in the intellectual air, a particularly sort of broadly Platonic way of thinking, but there are other people that thought in much more sort of seemingly Stoic ways. I mean, read some of Paul's letters in the New Testament, and his idea of something like, the Spirit of God looks much more Stoic than it does.
Well, you
Platonic. Deal
with that as well. You suggest that quite a lot of terms and words have been smoothed or bowdlerized. The Spirit goes back to the breath of God, where it's a literal breath.
And you find
the earlier stories.
Yeah, I mean, and you find that. I mean, these terms are all really elastic and deliberately so. I mean, look at the way that English terms are very elastic as well. None of us are. Language is a really extraordinary thing. So I think it's about theological preferences in translation. So we're used to seeing, when you open a Bible now into the New Testament and you read the word Spirit, it will probably have a capital letter on the front of it, and it will probably have a definite article in the front of it. But if you look at the Greek, it's not the case. Sometimes it could be a spirit or just spirit, and there's no capital letter in the way that we use it in English syntax today. So it's we are reading texts not just in translation of language, but in terms of translation of culture, and that's why I think it's just by pointing out things like, the word pneuma in Greek, it can mean a breath or a spirit or a wind or the spirit or it's
so it's as
context.
plastic as the original.
And context matters.
Hebrew.
So and in the Hebrew, obviously the primary term is ruach. So when we read about the ruach of God in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, was hovering over the water. Again, open a lot of Bibles and you'll find that translated as spirit, sometimes with a big capital S, but it could mean wind or breath, which is probably what it does mean in those texts.
Are there any deliberate mistranslations? You refer to, there's a passage where the face of God, say he confronts the face of God, somebody, and we now read it in the Bible as in being in the presence of God. Are there any deliberate ones, or are they?
You get a lot of ancient deliberate ones, in the ancient context where things have been deliberately changed because the scribes are really sensitive. They're like, so for example, there's a passage in which in the Hebrew Bible in which people are instructed to come and bring food offerings basically to the deity in his presence. And in the Greek text, the ancient Greek, it's much more clear that this seems to indicate, that the deity, you put it before his face, whereas in the later Hebrew translation, it's complicated in terms of manuscript, the later manuscript tradition. It's been sort of fudged. It's kind of been sort of loosened up a bit. There's a bit where, for example, I mean, you get names changed all the time. You can see deliberate changes to names. So things like Ishbal is the name of one of the sons of Saul, but it's been sort of changed in later Hebrew tradition, manuscript tradition. So when the copyists are reproducing these texts over and over, they're changing it to Ishbosheth, which kind of means they're changing the word Baal, which is the name of a deity, to a word that looks like it might mean something like shame, man of shame. Ishbal, man of Baal, or man of the divine Lord, becomes Ishbosheth, a man of shame. So that kind of deliberate alteration, fudging, theological transformation, a smoothing, happens in the ancient world as much as it does in the contemporary world.
Well, I shall not read the Bible again without your book next to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So the book is God and Anatomy by Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou. It's published by Picador at £25. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thanks.
That was Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Books Podcast is a Green Shoot production. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.